a glamorous high society party, or a carefully staged humiliation. When a mistress believes she can disgrace a pregnant wife in front of the city's elite, with her husband's family standing there laughing, certain their power makes them untouchable. A plate tips, sauce is thrown across a woman's face. The room chooses mockery over humanity, and no one steps in, convinced silence will protect them. What happens next is not just scandal, but a slow collapse of privilege, where evidence replaces influence and justice advances without mercy. And trust me, you will not see how far the consequences reach until we step inside this story together. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The Hayes estate rose above the city like a monument to certainty, its white stone walls glowing under carefully placed lights that erased every shadow. Valets guided luxury cars into perfect lines, and music drifted through the open doors with calculated elegance. This was not a celebration born of warmth, but a display of order and dominance. Guests arrived already aware that every step, every glance would be observed. Power lived here, not loudly, but with the quiet confidence of people who believed the world naturally bent in their direction. Inside the grand hall, conversations overlapped in polished tones. Laughter was controlled, measured, never careless. Crystal glasses reflected chandeliers, and the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the subtle sharpness of ambition. Deals had already been discussed before dinner was served. Every invitation had purpose. Every seat had been assigned with intent. The Hayes family moved through the room like owners inspecting property, acknowledging some guests, ignoring others, always aware of their position at the center. Lillian Hayes entered slowly, one hand resting instinctively against her pregnant belly. Her light sky blue maternity dress fell softly around her, elegant yet restrained, chosen to avoid attention rather than attract it. She was visibly expecting, and that reality followed her like a fragile boundary. Some guests smiled politely. Others looked away too quickly. Lillian felt the familiar tension in her chest, the sense of being present but never truly included. Tonight, she was the wife on display, not the woman being honored. Mark Hayes walked beside her, his posture straight, his navy suit perfectly fitted. From a distance, they looked united, a picture of success and stability. Up close, the distance between them was unmistakable. Mark's gaze drifted across the room, focused on greetings that mattered to him. His hand never reached for Lillian's. He acknowledged her presence only when necessary, as if she were another accessory to the evening. To him, the event demanded his full attention, and sentiment had no place in its execution. Claire Morgan arrived moments later, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Her red dress contrasted sharply with the muted tones around her, a deliberate choice that drew eyes without apology. She carried herself with confidence that bordered on challenge, her smile sharp and self-assured. She did not hesitate at the threshold, did not search for permission. She entered as someone who believed she belonged wherever she chose to stand. Several heads turned. A few murmurs followed. Claire noticed them all. Across the room, Margaret Hayes observed the scene with thinly veiled judgment. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes betrayed calculation rather than welcome. She said nothing as Claire approached familiar faces, accepting compliments with practiced ease. Robert Hayes stood beside his wife, hands folded behind his back, his silence deliberate. Neither spoke to Lillian. Their attention lingered instead on the balance of appearances, weighing advantage against discomfort. In their world, discomfort was acceptable if it served power. Lillian felt the weight of isolation deepen as the evening progressed. Conversations flowed around her, but rarely included her. When she spoke, responses were brief, polite, and quickly redirected. She noticed how often eyes flicked toward her belly, then away, as if it complicated the image the family preferred to project. She adjusted her posture, breathing carefully, reminding herself why she was here. For her child, she told herself, just for tonight. The room itself seemed to reinforce the divide. The tables were arranged to encourage alliances, clustering influence where it belonged. Lillian's seat placed her near the edge of the central group, close enough to be seen, far enough to be ignored. Mark took his place without hesitation, already engaged in conversation. Claire stood nearby, laughing softly at a comment from one of the guests, her confidence unchallenged. The contrast was unmistakable, and Lillian felt it settle into her bones. Despite the tension, the evening maintained its polished surface. Staff moved efficiently, trays balanced with precision, music swelled and softened at calculated intervals. The illusion of harmony held, fragile but intact. Lillian watched the room, sensing an undercurrent she could not name, something coiled beneath the civility. She kept her hand on her belly, grounding herself, listening to the rhythm of her own breath as a quiet defense against the unease building inside her. As the first course was prepared and guests were guided toward their seats, the energy shifted subtly. Conversations paused, glances aligned, and attention gathered toward the center of the room. The night was moving forward, toward something inevitable. Lillian felt it, a tightening she could not explain, as if the space itself were holding its breath. The power on display had not yet revealed its true cost, but it was preparing to. The evening had only just begun, and the next moment would change everything. The serving staff began to move through the hall with synchronized precision, carrying the main course as if it were part of a rehearsed ceremony. The gentle clink of plates and the controlled murmur of conversation created an atmosphere that felt tight rather than festive. Lillian sat upright at her place, shoulders squared, her breathing measured. One hand rested protectively over her abdomen, a quiet instinct she had learned to trust. She could sense eyes on her, not openly hostile, but alert, watching, waiting. The room no longer felt neutral, it felt expectant. Across the table, Claire Morgan observed her closely. Claire's posture was relaxed, almost casual, but her gaze was sharp with intention. She leaned slightly toward the guests beside her, speaking in a tone that carried just far enough to be noticed. The words themselves were light, almost playful, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. They were designed to test boundaries, to probe how far she could go without resistance. Lillian heard them clearly. She chose not to respond. Silence, she knew, denied Claire the reaction she wanted. Claire's smile lingered as she straightened in her chair. She reached for her plate, fingers curling around its edge with deliberate calm. The movement was unhurried, controlled, as though she were simply adjusting her position. A few nearby guests paused mid-conversation. Chairs shifted slightly. The air felt heavier, though no one could yet name why. Lillian noticed the motion only at the last moment, her eyes lifting instinctively as Claire stepped closer. They stood facing each other at a distance that allowed no misunderstanding. For a brief second, their eyes met. Lillian saw no surprise there, no uncertainty. Claire's expression was composed, resolved. It was not anger that drove her, but certainty, the confidence of someone who believed the room would support whatever she chose to do next. That certainty was more chilling than any raised voice. The act itself was swift and unmistakable. Claire tilted the plate forward, and the thick sauce slid free, striking Lillian's face before she could move. It spread across her cheek, her lashes, her hair, then dripped down onto the front of her light blue dress. The warmth of it startled her, the smell intrusive and sharp. The stain was immediate and visible, impossible to dismiss as an accident. Every person in the hall could see what had just happened. For 2 or 3 seconds, the entire room fell into absolute silence. No one spoke, no one moved. The music seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Lillian stood frozen, eyes blinking slowly as sauce clung to her skin. She did not lift her hands, she did not wipe her face. Instead, she pressed her palm more firmly against her belly, grounding herself, focusing on her breathing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The silence broke, not with protest, but with laughter. Margaret Hayes laughed first, a clear sound that cut through the stillness. It was not nervous or uncertain, it was deliberate. Others followed, some quickly, some after a pause, their laughter uneven but unmistakably aligned. Robert Hayes did not join them aloud, yet his expression remained unchanged, his silence signaling approval as clearly as words could have. In that moment, the hierarchy of the room was confirmed. Mark Hayes remained seated. He did not rise, did not turn toward his wife. His gaze stayed forward, fixed on the table, as if the event unfolding before him required no response. The absence of action spoke louder than any defense might have. His stillness marked his position, not beside Lillian, but apart from her. It defined his role in what had just occurred. Claire stepped back, her smile widening as she took in the reaction around her. She made no attempt to excuse the act. There was no apology, no pretense of clumsiness. She allowed the moment to stand as it was, confident that the room had already accepted her behavior. A few guests averted their eyes, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others watched closely, absorbing the spectacle without comment. Lillian remained where she stood, her posture rigid, her breathing shallow but controlled. She could feel her heart racing, the pressure building behind her eyes, yet she refused to move. To react would have turned the humiliation into entertainment. Endurance, she understood, was the only control left to her. The weight of the stairs pressed against her, each one reinforcing the reality of what had been done and who had been permitted to do it. The laughter gradually softened into murmurs, but the damage had already been sealed. The act was complete. The message had been delivered without ambiguity. Lillian's silence was not weakness. It was the line she chose to hold, the last boundary available to her in a room that had already decided its loyalties. The power on display had revealed itself fully, and its consequences would not remain confined to this moment. The hall did not yet understand it, but something irreversible had been set in motion. The silence that followed did not fade when the laughter softened. It lingered, thick and suffocating, settling into every corner of the hall. Lillian remained standing where she was, her body rigid, her senses sharpened by shock. The sauce continued to drip slowly from her hair and along the fabric of her dress, each drop marking time in a room that refused to acknowledge what had happened. No one rushed forward, no one offered a napkin. The absence of movement became a statement in itself. She kept her hands where they were, one pressed firmly against her abdomen, the other hanging at her side. Her breathing stayed shallow but steady, controlled with effort. Inside her chest, panic threatened to rise, but she pushed it down, focusing on the familiar rhythm beneath her palm. That rhythm mattered more than the eyes watching her. It mattered more than the humiliation burning across her skin. In that stillness, she made a choice to endure rather than collapse. Around her, reactions unfolded without words. Margaret Hayes leaned back in her chair, her laughter tapering into a satisfied smile. Her eyes scanned the room, gauging responses, confirming alignment. This was not cruelty born of impulse. It was cruelty reinforced by expectation. Robert Hayes remained silent, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. He neither approved aloud nor objected. His silence carried authority, signaling that no correction was necessary. Claire stood a short distance away, savoring the aftermath. Her confidence did not waver. She adjusted her posture, smoothing the front of her dress as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. The act had spoken clearly enough. The room had answered in kind. Mark Hayes did not look at his wife. His focus remained fixed ahead, detached, deliberate. The space between him and Lillian felt wider than the length of the table. He did not flinch. He did not shift in his seat. His stillness confirmed what everyone else already sensed. This silence was permitted. It was protected. Guests responded in small, telling ways. Some lowered their eyes, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the authority surrounding them. Others exchanged brief glances, their expressions carefully neutral. No one intervened. The collective decision was made without discussion. Whatever boundaries had been crossed were not worth disrupting the evening. Order would be maintained at any cost. Lillian absorbed every detail with painful clarity. The quiet was louder than any insult. It told her exactly where she stood. She felt her throat tighten, the urge to speak pressing against restraint. She resisted it. Words would not restore dignity here. They would only expose vulnerability in a room that thrived on it. The silence stretched on, cruel in its persistence. It forced her to remain visible, to stand as evidence of what had been allowed. The stain on her dress drew eyes repeatedly, a visual reminder no one attempted to erase. She became the center of attention without being acknowledged, reduced to an object lesson in power and permission. Finally, she turned her head slowly, scanning the faces around her. Not in search of help, but in quiet recognition. She saw who smiled. She saw who looked away. She saw who remained unmoved. Each reaction etched itself into her memory, creating a map she would never forget. This was not a single act of humiliation. It was a collective choice. When she took her first step away from the table, it was measured and deliberate. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Her movements were controlled, almost formal, as though she were exiting a stage after an unwanted performance. No one stopped her. No one followed. The path cleared without resistance, confirming how easily she could be dismissed once the moment had passed. As she moved through the hall, the silence followed her. Conversations did not resume immediately. The room waited, uncertain, as if testing whether the order had truly been restored. When she reached the edge of the space, the murmurs began again, cautious at first, then gradually returning to their previous volume. The performance of normalcy reassembled itself piece by piece. Lillian did not look back. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, on keeping her balance, on maintaining the composure that had become her armor. Inside, the impact of what had occurred settled heavily. The humiliation had not ended with the act. It deepened in the aftermath, in the silence that framed it, in the ease with which everyone moved on. By the time she reached the threshold leading out of the hall, the weight in her chest had become almost unbearable. Her hands trembled slightly, though she kept them steady by sheer will. She understood now that what had been taken from her could not be reclaimed in that room. The silence had done its work. It had stripped away any illusion of safety she once believed existed there. As she stepped beyond the reach of the chandeliers and the controlled laughter, the sound behind her softened, replaced by the distant echo of a world that no longer felt accessible. What remained was clarity, sharp and unforgiving. The silence she had endured was not empty. It was deliberate, structured, and cruel, and it marked the end of something she could never return to, carrying her forward toward consequences that were only beginning to take shape. The lights of the hall receded behind Lillian as she stepped into the cooler corridor, but the humiliation did not remain inside. It followed her, heavy and persistent, clinging to her skin and thoughts alike. Each step away from the music and controlled laughter felt unsteady, as if the ground itself had lost its balance. She focused on walking, on keeping her posture upright, on not giving the silence behind her the satisfaction of watching her break. By the time she reached the driveway, the night air struck her face sharply. The sudden change in temperature made her shiver, and with it came a wave of dizziness she could not ignore. Her vision blurred at the edges. She paused, one hand gripping the stone railing, the other still resting over her abdomen. Her breathing grew uneven, shallow pulls of air that did little to calm the tightening in her chest. The pain began as a dull pressure low in her stomach, unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. She closed her eyes, hoping it would pass, telling herself it was shock, that it was temporary. Instead, it intensified, spreading with alarming speed. Her heart raced, each beat loud in her ears. The realization that something was wrong settled over her with cold clarity. She tried to steady herself, to take another step forward, but her knees weakened without warning. The world tilted, lights stretching into indistinct streaks. Lillian gasped, the sound sharp and involuntary, and reached instinctively for her belly. Panic surged, stronger than anything she had felt inside the hall. This fear was different. It was immediate, physical, impossible to reason away. No one from the party appeared at her side. The grand entrance remained distant, illuminated but indifferent. In that moment, the isolation she had endured emotionally became tangible, absolute. She was alone with her pain, alone with the consequences that had followed her out into the night. With trembling hands, she reached into her bag and fumbled for her phone. Her fingers struggled to unlock the screen. Each second felt longer than the last. She managed to dial emergency services, her voice barely steady as she described her condition and location. The words came out clipped and breathless, but they were enough. Help was on the way, she was told. She clung to that assurance, lowering herself carefully to the ground as another sharp cramp seized her. Time stretched as she waited. The lights above her seemed too bright, the air too thin. Her thoughts fractured, jumping between memories of the evening and the fear now consuming her. She pressed her palm against her abdomen, whispering reassurance she was not sure she believed. The humiliation of the night faded in comparison to the terror that now eclipsed everything else. When the ambulance arrived, its lights cut through the darkness with abrupt urgency. The sound of sirens filled the space that had moments earlier been quiet and controlled. Paramedics moved quickly, their voices calm but firm as they assessed her condition. They spoke to her directly, asked her questions, waited for her responses. The contrast was jarring. For the first time that night, someone acknowledged her distress without judgment or indifference. She was placed onto a stretcher, the motion careful but efficient. As they lifted her, pain flared again, stronger than before. She cried out, unable to contain it, her composure finally breaking under the strain. The paramedic closest to her adjusted the straps, offered reassurance, and monitored her vitals with focused attention. Lillian clung to consciousness, forcing herself to answer when spoken to stay present despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. The ride to the hospital passed in fragments. Bright lights overhead, the steady beep of equipment, voices exchanging information she struggled to follow. Her thoughts narrowed to a single focus, the life she carried, the possibility she could not allow herself to fully consider. She breathed as instructed, gripping the edge of the stretcher, her body tense with anticipation and dread. At the hospital, she was transferred swiftly into an examination room. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, their movements practiced and purposeful. Questions were asked, answers recorded, monitors were attached. The clinical environment replaced the cold elegance of the party with stark reality. Here, appearances held no value, only facts mattered. The initial assessment confirmed what she already feared. Her body was reacting violently to the stress she had endured. The pain, the dizziness, the sudden onset of symptoms all pointed to a dangerous escalation. She watched the staff's expressions closely, searching for reassurance, for any sign that the situation was under control. Their professionalism offered some comfort, but uncertainty lingered in the pauses between actions. As she lay there, the events of the evening replayed in her mind, no longer abstract or distant. The laughter, the silence, the deliberate humiliation, all of it had followed her here, translated into physical consequences she could not escape. The realization settled heavily. What had happened was not confined to memory. It had reached into her body, into the fragile balance sustaining her and her child. She thought briefly of Mark, of whether he knew where she was, whether he would come. The thought passed quickly, replaced by a sharper awareness of reality. Whatever choices he had made, she now faced this moment alone. The focus shifted inward, toward survival, toward endurance of a different kind. As the medical team continued their work, the urgency stabilized into focused vigilance. Lillian's breathing slowed slightly under guidance. The pain eased just enough to allow clarity. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the hospital, each one grounding her in the present. The fall had come swiftly, immediately after the lights and music, stripping away any illusion that the night could end without consequence. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one truth had already emerged. The cruelty she had endured under polished chandeliers had followed her into a place where it could no longer be dismissed as social spectacle. The night had crossed a line, and as the hospital lights reflected off sterile surfaces around her, Lillian understood that the aftermath was only beginning, carrying her forward into a phase she could not turn away from, no matter how much she wished to. Lillian lay awake in the hospital room long after the monitors had settled into their steady rhythm. The ceiling lights were dimmed, yet sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, the images returned with unsettling clarity. The polished hall, the faces turned toward her, the sudden weight of silence. She replayed the evening, not as a blur, but in fragments sharp enough to cut. Lying still beneath the thin blanket, she realized the humiliation had not ended when she left the party. It had followed her here, reshaped into memory, looping without mercy. The next morning, the medical team gathered quietly at the foot of her bed. Their tone was professional, measured, but their expressions carried weight. One doctor explained the findings carefully, choosing words with precision. The stress she had endured had triggered a dangerous response. The baby's heart had shown signs of temporary distress. It had stabilized, but the incident was real, documented, and serious. Lillian listened without interruption, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen. Relief and fear tangled together in her chest. The danger had passed for now, but the warning could not be ignored. Her medical records reflected more than symptoms. They traced a clear connection between psychological trauma and physical consequence. Notes were entered, times recorded, observations confirmed by multiple professionals. This was not speculation. It was evidence. The doctors explained that such records carried legal weight when harm resulted from intentional actions. Lillian absorbed the information slowly. The idea that the night's cruelty could be translated into something tangible, something undeniable, felt foreign but grounding. For the first time since the party, the truth had a shape that could not be laughed away. Later that afternoon, Martha Green arrived quietly. She did not announce herself or seek attention. She introduced herself to the nurse, then approached Lillian's bedside with caution, her demeanor respectful and restrained. Martha explained that she had been present at the party, close enough to witness everything clearly. She spoke without drama, without judgment. Her concern was practical, focused. She asked how Lillian was feeling, then paused, as if allowing space for trust to form before continuing. Martha revealed that she possessed a recording of the incident, not a partial clip or an edited fragment, but the original footage, captured clearly from beginning to end. She emphasized that the video had never been shared, it had not been posted, leaked, or circulated in any form. She had kept it deliberately, aware of its significance, waiting to see whether it would be needed. The choice to remain silent until now had not been easy, but it had been intentional. Lillian listened, her pulse quickening. The idea that the moment she wished she could erase existed in such a permanent form was unsettling. Yet beneath that discomfort was something else, a quiet sense of validation. Someone had seen what happened and understood its gravity. Martha explained that she had not acted impulsively. She had considered the consequences, the risks, and the responsibility attached to possessing such evidence. Her goal was not exposure for its own sake, but accountability. She made her position clear. The video would not be released publicly. It would not become spectacle or entertainment. Instead, she intended to give it to one person only, someone capable of using it properly. She named Daniel Carter, Lillian's brother. Martha had researched him carefully, understanding his background and his reputation. She believed he would act with purpose rather than emotion. This decision, she said, was not negotiable. The mention of Daniel shifted something inside Lillian. Until that moment, she had been navigating everything alone, moving from shock to endurance by sheer will. The thought of her brother's involvement brought a complicated mix of relief and apprehension. She knew Daniel's nature. He was deliberate, protective, and unafraid of confrontation when necessary. If he stepped into this, there would be no turning back. The situation would move beyond private suffering into something far more consequential. Daniel arrived the following day. He entered the room without haste, his presence calm but unmistakably focused. He listened as Lillian spoke, allowing her to recount only what she wished. He did not interrupt, did not rush her through the details. When Martha joined them, she presented the video without ceremony. There was no dramatic exchange, only a clear transfer of responsibility. Daniel accepted it silently, understanding the weight it carried. They reviewed the initial evidence together. The video, the medical records, the timeline of events. Daniel asked precise questions, noting connections, confirming facts. He did not react visibly to the footage, but his stillness spoke volumes. This was no longer just a family matter. It was a documented sequence of actions and consequences, each piece fit with unsettling clarity. Before leaving, Daniel assured Lillian that nothing would be done recklessly. He would proceed carefully, methodically. The goal was not revenge, but truth. The truth, he explained, had already been hidden once by laughter and silence. It would not be hidden again. Lillian watched him go, aware that a line had been crossed, not by her, but by those who had underestimated the power of what they allowed. As the room quieted once more, Lillian rested her hand over her abdomen and closed her eyes. The truth had been held back, protected from distortion, preserved for the right moment. That moment was approaching. The silence that once suffocated her now carried a different meaning. It was no longer empty. It was charged, waiting. What had been endured in isolation was beginning to take form, guiding her forward toward a reckoning that was no longer abstract, but inevitable. Daniel Carter did not arrive with anger on his face. He arrived with focus. From the moment he stepped into the hospital room, his attention moved deliberately, taking in Lillian's condition, the equipment, the quiet tension that lingered in the air. He did not ask dramatic questions or offer emotional reassurances. Instead, he listened. He let his sister speak at her own pace, noting every detail, every pause, every moment where her voice tightened. What mattered to him was accuracy. He needed to understand exactly what had happened, without interpretation, without exaggeration. Once he had the full account, Daniel began verifying it piece by piece. He requested timelines, locations, and names. He asked when the symptoms began, how long the pain lasted, who was present at each stage. His approach was methodical, shaped by experience rather than impulse. This was not about confronting anyone yet. It was about establishing a foundation strong enough to withstand scrutiny. His next step was the medical record. Daniel met with the attending physician and requested access to the documented findings. The discussion remained professional and precise. The doctor explained the diagnosis in clear terms, pointing out the recorded indicators of fetal distress and the connection to acute psychological trauma. Daniel reviewed the notes carefully, confirming timestamps and signatures. He did not argue. He did not dramatize. The record spoke for itself, and that was exactly what he needed. With the medical documentation secured, Daniel arranged a meeting with Martha Green. Their conversation was brief and direct. Martha presented the original video without hesitation, explaining again that it had never been shared or edited. Daniel inspected the file, confirming its integrity, the clarity of the footage, and the continuity of the recording. The sequence was unmistakable. The act was deliberate. The context was undeniable. There was no ambiguity that could be explained away as accident or misunderstanding. Daniel did not react outwardly as he watched. He simply noted details, positioning, timing, proximity, the expressions on surrounding faces. Every frame reinforced the same conclusion. This was intentional humiliation carried out with confidence that it would be tolerated. When the video ended, Daniel closed the device and thanked Martha. The transfer of responsibility was complete. He then turned his attention outward, expanding the scope of verification. Daniel began contacting individuals who had attended the event. He did not accuse or threaten. He asked neutral questions, requesting statements about what they had seen. Some declined. Others responded cautiously. A few, unsettled by what they had witnessed, agreed to speak openly. Their accounts varied in tone, but aligned in substance. The act had occurred exactly as recorded. The reaction of the room had been clear. No one had intervened. As these testimonies accumulated, Daniel organized them carefully. Each statement was logged, dated, and cross-referenced with the video and medical timeline. The pattern was consistent. This was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was a collective failure enabled by silence and laughter. The evidence was no longer fragmented. It was forming a cohesive narrative. With this foundation in place, Daniel reached out to legal counsel. His initial consultations were exploratory, focused on jurisdiction, applicable statutes, and evidentiary thresholds. He then contacted the prosecutor's office, presenting a preliminary outline of the case. He did not dramatize the facts. He let the documentation speak. The response was measured but attentive. The combination of video evidence, medical records, and corroborating witness statements warranted further action. As preparations advanced, word began to circulate quietly. Mark Hayes noticed the shift before it was openly acknowledged. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. The confidence that once defined his posture eroded into visible unease. He did not yet know the full extent of what Daniel had gathered, but he sensed the loss of control. Power, when threatened, recognizes its own vulnerability quickly. Within the Hayes family, conversations changed in tone. Strategies were discussed behind closed doors. Emphasis shifted from display to containment. They explored ways to minimize exposure, to reframe the narrative, to discourage cooperation. None of it reached Daniel directly, but the attempts themselves confirmed what he already knew. They were afraid of what the truth could do when properly presented. Throughout this process, Daniel kept Lillian informed without overwhelming her. He explained each step clearly, outlining what had been verified and what remained to be done. He emphasized that no action would proceed without her consent. This was her experience, her body, her consequences. He would not move forward unless she chose to. Lillian listened carefully. The weight of the past days pressed heavily on her, but something had shifted. The isolation she had felt was no longer absolute. The facts were no longer trapped in memory. They existed outside her, documented, structured, acknowledged. When Daniel asked whether she was prepared to continue, she did not answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, then rested one gently over her abdomen. When she spoke, her voice was steady. She said she would not remain silent anymore. The decision did not come from anger or revenge. It came from clarity. Silence had protected others, not her. It had allowed the harm to deepen and spread. She would not offer it again. Daniel accepted her answer without comment. The plan moved forward, no longer tentative but deliberate. The groundwork had been laid. Verification had replaced doubt. Evidence had replaced dismissal. As Daniel left the hospital that evening, he understood that the next phase would not be quiet. What began as endurance was becoming resistance, and the path ahead was now clearly defined. Lillian's recovery was not marked by sudden strength, but by a quiet return of resolve. As the days passed in the hospital, her focus narrowed to what mattered most. Each time she felt the steady movement beneath her hand, she reminded herself why she had endured the humiliation in silence, and why she could not allow that silence to continue. Fear still lingered, but it no longer governed her decisions. The presence of her child gave her clarity, a reason to stand upright again, even while confined to a hospital bed. When Daniel explained the next step, Lillian listened carefully. Becoming the primary witness meant accepting visibility, scrutiny, and challenge. It meant revisiting the event not as memory, but as testimony. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked for time. That evening, alone with the low hum of hospital equipment, she considered the weight of what was being asked. Remaining silent had protected no one. Speaking carried risk, but it also carried purpose. The following morning, she gave her consent and signed the formal confirmation. The decision was deliberate, steady, and irreversible. With Lillian's statement secured, the process accelerated. Witnesses who had hesitated before were contacted again. This time, the tone was different. Knowing that the victim herself had stepped forward shifted the balance. Several guests agreed to provide full accounts. Their statements varied in perspective, but they aligned in fact. The act had been intentional. The reaction of the room had been permissive. The silence had been collective. Each testimony reinforced the others, building a record that could not be dismissed as isolated opinion. As these accounts were gathered, the medical file expanded alongside them. Additional evaluations were documented, confirming the earlier findings. Specialists reviewed the records and added their assessments. The connection between acute emotional trauma and physical consequence was supported by professional consensus. Each entry strengthened the foundation of the case, transforming personal suffering into documented harm. The file grew thicker, more comprehensive, and more difficult to ignore. Outside the hospital, attention began to shift. Initial curiosity from media outlets evolved into focused interest as verified information emerged. Reports avoided speculation, relying instead on confirmed facts. The combination of witness statements and medical documentation created a narrative that demanded examination. What had once been contained within a private event now carried public relevance. The story did not spread through rumor, but through substantiated detail. The Hayes family felt the pressure almost immediately. Invitations were declined, partnerships stalled. Questions that once could be brushed aside now lingered. Attempts to redirect attention failed to gain traction. The familiar confidence that had defined their public presence fractured under sustained scrutiny. Their usual strategies of control proved ineffective against evidence that spoke for itself. Claire attempted to distance herself from the incident, offering explanations that shifted tone with each retelling. At times, she framed the act as misunderstanding, at others as provocation. None of these accounts aligned with the recorded footage or witness testimony. Inconsistencies accumulated quickly. Each attempt to deflect responsibility only deepened suspicion. Her credibility eroded with every statement, and the narrative she hoped to control slipped beyond reach. Mark Hayes faced growing examination as well. Investigators questioned his role not as a bystander, but as a participant through inaction. His presence, his silence, and his authority within the setting were all considered. The absence of intervention became a focal point, raising questions about consent and complicity. The inquiry did not accuse without basis. It followed evidence, and that evidence pointed steadily toward accountability. As these developments unfolded, public response intensified. Social commentary shifted from curiosity to concern. Support for Lillian emerged alongside broader discussions about power and silence. The case resonated beyond the individuals involved, reflecting patterns many recognized but rarely saw addressed. Pressure mounted from multiple directions: legal, social, and reputational. What had been dismissed as an isolated incident now carried collective weight. Through it all, Daniel maintained careful coordination, ensuring that each step aligned with established procedure. He shielded Lillian from unnecessary exposure, sharing updates without overwhelming her. He reminded her that the pace would be deliberate, not reactive. The goal was not spectacle, but truth, presented with precision. Lillian trusted that process, even when the attention surrounding her felt intense. Despite the strain, Lillian felt something unfamiliar taking hold. The fear that once paralyzed her was giving way to steadiness. She was no longer defined solely by what had been done to her. She was defining what would follow. Each confirmation, each corroborated statement, reinforced her decision to speak. The act of resistance was not loud or dramatic. It was persistent, grounded, and deliberate. As the groundwork solidified, a pivotal moment approached. Plans were made for a formal unveiling of the evidence, structured to ensure transparency and accountability. Dates were discussed, logistics considered, and legal protocols reviewed. Nothing was left to chance. The process demanded patience, but its direction was clear. The reckoning would not be private. It would be witnessed. When Daniel informed Lillian that the timing had been set, she absorbed the news in silence. She did not ask for details. She understood what it meant. The night that had marked her humiliation was being transformed into a point of confrontation. The exposure she once feared was now a tool she chose to wield. As she rested her hand over her abdomen and closed her eyes, Lillian felt the weight of anticipation settle in. The resistance she had begun was no longer solitary. It had momentum, structure, and purpose. The path ahead was demanding, but it was defined. The quiet endurance of the past was giving way to action, and the moment of revelation was no longer distant. It was approaching, shaped by truth, and carried forward by the refusal to remain silent. The evening unfolded beneath crystal lights and polished ceilings, a gathering designed to reaffirm status and visibility among the city's most influential figures. Invitations had been issued weeks in advance, and attendance was not optional for those whose names carried weight. Cameras lined the perimeter, discreet but ready, as guests arrived dressed in confidence and expectation. It was an event meant to celebrate influence. Yet, beneath the refined surface, tension moved quietly, unnoticed by most. The Hayes family arrived together, their presence drawing immediate attention. Their expressions were composed, carefully managed, as if nothing extraordinary threatened the order they relied upon. Mark Hayes moved through the crowd with measured assurance, acknowledging greetings, returning smiles that did not quite reach his eyes. Claire Morgan followed close by, her posture rigid, her usual confidence muted but not absent. They took their places among familiar faces, surrounded by a sense of inevitability they could not yet name. When Daniel Carter entered, the atmosphere shifted subtly. He did not seek attention, yet his presence altered the room's balance. Those who recognized him exchanged brief glances, uncertain, alert. He waited until the program reached its scheduled pause, until the moment when the audience's focus naturally gathered toward the center. Then he stepped forward, his movements calm, deliberate, leaving no doubt that what followed had been planned. Without introduction or commentary, Daniel addressed the room. His voice carried clearly, steady and controlled. He explained that what he was about to present was unedited and verified. No speculation, no interpretation, only record. As the lights dimmed slightly, screens positioned around the hall came to life. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The space grew still. The footage began without warning. The familiar setting appeared on screen, the same hall many in attendance recognized. Claire Morgan was visible, approaching Lillian Hayes with composed intent. The plate in her hands tilted. The sauce struck Lillian's face. The image was unmistakable, framed clearly from start to finish. Gasps rippled through the room as recognition spread. The moment played out exactly as it had occurred, stripped of context, stripped of excuse. As the video continued, the silence in the hall deepened. The 2 or 3 seconds of absolute stillness following the act were preserved in full, forcing the audience to sit with them. Then the laughter emerged, sharp and undeniable. Faces in the room mirrored those on the screen, some in shock, others in discomfort. The contrast between expectation and reality settled heavily over the crowd. When the footage ended, no one spoke. The absence of sound felt heavier than any reaction could have been. The Hayes family remained seated, their composure visibly strained. There was no explanation that could undo what had just been shown. The act could not be reframed. The response could not be denied. The evidence stood on its own. Claire Morgan's reaction was immediate and unguarded. The color drained from her face as she realized the scope of what had been revealed. She attempted to speak, then stopped, her words dissolving before they formed. Her posture faltered, the confidence she had relied upon collapsing under the weight of exposure. The room watched in silence as the certainty she once carried abandoned her. Mark Hayes shifted in his seat, the attention turning toward him with quiet insistence. His presence in the video, his stillness, his failure to intervene, all became part of the narrative now unfolding. Names were spoken softly at first, then with growing clarity. His role was no longer peripheral, it was central. The authority he had assumed now magnified the consequences of his inaction. Around them, reactions multiplied. Some guests stared openly, unable to mask their disbelief. Others lowered their eyes, confronted with their own silence mirrored back at them. Phones appeared, capturing the moment as it unfolded, no longer discreet. The controlled environment gave way to a surge of attention that could not be contained. What had been private was now undeniably public. Within minutes, reporters outside the venue began receiving updates. Information spread rapidly, amplified by verified footage and first-hand accounts. Headlines formed almost immediately, grounded in evidence rather than rumor. The narrative took shape with speed and clarity, leaving little room for denial or distortion. The story was no longer about speculation. It was about accountability. Daniel remained composed as the room absorbed the impact. He did not linger on the stage or invite response. His role was complete. The truth had been presented without embellishment. What followed would proceed through proper channels, beyond the control of those who had once dictated outcomes through influence alone. As the event concluded in fractured silence, the atmosphere bore little resemblance to the celebration that had been planned. Conversations did not resume. Alliances felt suddenly uncertain. The Hayes family departed under scrutiny rather than admiration, their exit marked by whispered commentary and flashing cameras. The order they had relied upon had shifted irrevocably. Outside, The crowd of media expanded, voices rising as the significance of the revelation settled in. Law enforcement officials arrived quietly, their presence signaling the transition from exposure to action. The night that had begun as a display of power ended as a turning point. Justice, long deferred by silence and laughter, had stepped forward, unmistakable and unavoidable, carrying the story into its final reckoning. The charges were filed quietly at first, but their impact spread quickly. Claire Morgan was formally indicted on criminal counts tied directly to the act committed at the Hayes event. The documentation was precise, supported by verified footage and corroborated testimony. There was no ambiguity in the language. What had once been dismissed as social cruelty was now defined as a criminal act with measurable harm. The process moved forward without delay. Mark Hayes was charged separately, named as an accomplice through willful inaction and abuse of authority. Investigators detailed his role clearly. His presence, his position, and his silence were no longer treated as neutral. They were framed as enabling behavior that allowed the harm to occur and continue. The distinction mattered. Responsibility was not limited to the person who acted, but extended to the one who permitted it. The trial was scheduled as a public proceeding. On the morning it began, the courthouse filled steadily. Reporters gathered outside, their presence orderly but persistent. Inside, observers took their seats with subdued anticipation. There was no spectacle in the setup. The formality of the space imposed its own gravity, reminding everyone present that this was no longer a matter of opinion or influence. It was a matter of law. Claire entered the courtroom first, her appearance markedly different from the confidence she once displayed. She avoided eye contact, her posture guarded. Mark followed, his expression controlled but strained. The contrast between their former public dominance and their current position was unmistakable. They were no longer hosts or figures of authority. They were defendants. Proceedings began with the presentation of evidence. The prosecution introduced the video without commentary, allowing it to play in full. The footage filled the room, clear and unedited. The act, the silence, the laughter, all unfolded exactly as they had occurred. The courtroom remained still as the recording ended. No explanation followed immediately. The image spoke for itself. Medical records were presented next. Physicians testified regarding the documented impact of acute psychological trauma on Lillian's condition. They explained the findings in measured terms, emphasizing the temporary but dangerous signs of fetal distress. The connection between the incident and the medical response was established through timeline and documentation. Each statement reinforced the seriousness of the harm. Witnesses were called in sequence. Guests from the event described what they had seen and how the room had responded. Their accounts aligned consistently. The act had been intentional. The reaction had been permissive. No one intervened. Each testimony added dimension without contradiction, forming a collective acknowledgement of what had taken place. Throughout the proceedings, the Hayes family's position deteriorated further. Public sentiment shifted decisively. Outside the courthouse, statements from former partners and affiliates began to surface. Contracts were suspended. Invitations were withdrawn. Associations dissolved quietly, but decisively. The social shield that once protected the family fractured under sustained scrutiny. The defense attempted to minimize the severity of the act, framing it as a lapse in judgment rather than criminal intent. These arguments failed to gain traction. The consistency of the evidence undermined any claim of accident or misunderstanding. The court's focus remained fixed on documented fact rather than narrative framing. As closing arguments concluded, the room held its breath. The judge reviewed the record carefully, referencing the sequence of events, the corroboration between evidence types, and the legal standards applied. The verdict was delivered without flourish. Claire Morgan was found guilty and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. The decision was firm, reflecting the gravity of the offense. Mark Hayes was sentenced next. The court addressed his role explicitly, stating that authority carries responsibility and silence in the face of harm constitutes participation when power is present. He was sentenced to prison as well, his status offering no mitigation. There would be no suspended sentence, no negotiated arrangement. The rulings were final. The courtroom reacted with restrained acknowledgement. There was no celebration, no outburst. The weight of the judgment settled evenly across the space. For those who had followed the case, the outcome confirmed what the evidence had shown from the beginning. Accountability had been applied without exception. As the defendants were escorted away, the broader consequences continued to unfold. The Hayes family's reputation collapsed under the verdict. Boards removed their names, foundations distanced themselves. What had once been influence dissolved into cautionary memory. The cost of silence became visible in real terms. Outside, the press relayed the outcome with clarity. Reports focused on the facts of the case and the legal reasoning behind the sentences. There was little speculation. The record spoke conclusively. The message was clear. Power did not exempt anyone from consequence. Inside the courthouse, the proceedings concluded quietly. The cycle of harm that began with a public act of humiliation ended with formal judgment. The law had addressed what society had once tolerated. The chapter closed not with noise, but with finality, carrying the story toward its last phase, where consequences would give way to resolution and the possibility of a future defined by choice rather than silence. Lillian's labor began quietly, without drama or urgency, in the early hours before dawn. The hospital room was calm, filled with soft light and steady movement. Doctors spoke in measured tones, nurses moved with practiced assurance, and every instruction was given with care. Lillian focused on breathing, on the present moment, on the life she was bringing into the world. When her child was finally placed in her arms, healthy and breathing, the tension she had carried for months released all at once. She did not cry from pain or fear. She cried from relief. What mattered most had survived. In the days that followed, recovery unfolded gently. Lillian held her baby often, memorizing every small detail, every sound, every movement. The world outside the hospital continued to react to the verdicts and consequences. But inside that room, her attention was centered on beginning again. The past was not erased, but it no longer defined every moment. She was no longer living in response to harm. She was living forward. As she transitioned home, Lillian began shaping a new routine. Simple tasks carried new meaning, feeding her child, walking through quiet rooms, allowing herself rest without guilt. Each decision was small, but intentional. This life was not built on endurance alone. It was built on choice. The silence that once surrounded her had been replaced by clarity, and clarity gave her peace she had not known before. The Hayes family faced their own reckoning. Invitations stopped arriving. Boards removed their names without public ceremony. Committees distanced themselves quietly, but firmly. The respect they once commanded dissolved into caution and avoidance. Their influence, once unquestioned, no longer carried weight. Reputation, so carefully maintained for years, unraveled with startling speed. There were no statements issued, no defenses offered. The verdicts had spoken clearly enough. Mark Hayes remained in custody, adjusting to a life stripped of privilege. The structure of confinement imposed limits he could not negotiate. His days followed routine rather than command. The authority he once exercised had no relevance within those walls. Messages from the outside grew infrequent, then ceased. The world he relied upon had moved on without him. Lillian did not visit. She did not call. She did not seek closure through conversation. Instead, she took a different step. Through her attorney, she prepared the divorce documents with careful attention. Each page was reviewed, each term confirmed. The process was handled with professionalism rather than emotion. When everything was complete, the papers were sent directly to the correctional facility. Mark received the documents in silence. There was no meeting, no discussion. The message was unambiguous. The marriage was over, not just in practice, but in law. He signed where required, his signature the final acknowledgement of what had already ended. There were no arguments left to make, no influence left to exert. The act was final. With that signature, the legal bond dissolved completely. Lillian felt no triumph, no bitterness. Only release. The chapter closed cleanly, without spectacle. What had bound her to a life of silence and endurance no longer existed. She was free, not because punishment had been delivered, but because she had chosen herself and her child over the weight of the past. As weeks turned into months, Lillian settled fully into her new life. Support came from unexpected places, but she learned to accept it without fear. She no longer questioned whether her voice mattered. She had seen what happened when it was heard. The experience had changed her, not by hardening her, but by grounding her in certainty. She knew where she stood. There were moments of reflection, quiet reminders of what had been lost and what had been endured. But those moments no longer carried the power to overwhelm her. They existed as part of her history, not her future. The pain had been real, but it was no longer the center of her story. On a calm afternoon, as she watched her child sleep, Lillian considered how far she had come. The humiliation, the silence, the fear, all of it had once felt endless. Now it felt distant, defined, contained. The truth had been acknowledged. Responsibility had been enforced. The rest was hers to shape. The story did not end with applause or celebration. It ended with quiet stability, with a home defined by safety rather than control, with days shaped by care rather than endurance. Lillian understood that freedom was not loud. It did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, in choices made without fear. Silence had once been her shield and her burden. It had protected others while costing her everything. Standing up had been difficult, but it had given her something silence never could: ownership of her life. As she moved forward, grounded in that truth, one understanding remained clear and unshakable. Silence had been pain. Standing up was freedom.